Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Yin Khvat. Today we're discussing the impact of Russia and China's blossoming relationship on the security of Japan, which Tokyo says is facing the most severe and complex security environment since World War II.
Российско-китайские отношения развиваются так, как мы и планировали в предыдущие годы. Все идет поступательно, развивается. Мы достигаем новых рубежей.
With me to discuss this are Guo Yuan, National Sun Yat-sen University Institute of China and Asia Pacific Studies Professor, Taiwan Society of Japanese Studies President, and Institute for National Policy Research Executive Director, and Raymond Song, Taiwan New Constitution Foundation Deputy CEO and an international relations expert. Professor Guo and Raymond Song, welcome to the show today. China's Foreign Minister Wang Yi has met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow amid vows to strengthen ties between Russia and China. Wang described Beijing's relationship with Moscow as solid as a mountain, echoing the term rock solid, which is used by the United States to describe its ties with friends and allies such as Taiwan. Meanwhile, Putin said that Russia-China cooperation was needed for so-called stability in international relations. His security chief added this.
В данном контексте хочу подтвердить нашу неизменную поддержку Пекину по вопросам Тайваня, Синьцзяня, Тибета и Гонконга, которые используются Западом для дискредитации Китая.
This follows a warning by the US to China not to risk significant escalation of the Ukraine war.
We've been watching this very, very closely. And for the most part, China has been engaged in providing rhetorical, political, diplomatic support to Russia. But we have information that gives us concern that they are considering providing lethal support to Russia in the war against Ukraine. And it was important for me to share very clearly with Wang Yi that this would be a serious problem.
Raymond, what can we make of this? The US intelligence that China intends to provide or is considering providing lethal support to Russia at the same time as Wang Yi announced that they are going to release a peace plan.
Yeah, it's very curious that the two incidences happened just before the convenience of the Munich Security Conference. And of course, we see a lot of diplomatic maneuvers from both sides, from the United States and China. It's noteworthy that Chinese has two faces. Firstly, they reassure again that the alliance between China and Russia are unlimited partnership. And as the Russia security advisor put it, it's unwavering support from Beijing. And of course, at the price of it, the Russia support Chinese claims to Taiwan, Xinjiang, and Hong Kong, etc. And another phase is what we see in the Munich Security Conference and before that, before Wang Yi's tour in European countries. And they try to put up a face of a charm offensive, try to persuade, reassure those countries that the Chinese market is always open for those countries and that Chinese country will work for peace. And they initiated the peace program and peace plan for Ukraine. And there are two phases. Chinese, I think this typical two-pronged strategy of CCP, Chinese Communist Party, that they want to charm. They want to put up they are a good guy in the international society, but back up by a threat. If you don't follow my plan or you try to refuse me or shut me out, I will side with Russia. So I will say it's a very delicate maneuver on the Chinese side. May I also add this, that the content of this peace plan is very hollow. It's containing a very elaborate words, but with not much content. And they are self-contradictory. For example, they argue that the territorial integrity of every country should be respected, including Ukraine, of course. And Chinese, by saying that, of course, is meaning that they have the right, reserve the right to unify Taiwan, to take over Taiwan. But at the same time, they propose Russia and Ukraine are going to engage in talks. I will ask, what are the principles behind those talks? So which one is the Chinese side stance? Are you supporting the territorial integrity of Ukraine as a basic principle for initiating peace talks? Or you want to achieve peace at the price of territorial sacrifice of Ukraine? I think that's the Chinese side needs to answer the question.
So there's a conflict there with the Chinese. Perhaps that's not so surprising. And Raymond talked about the public face, which we can say is offering this peace plan, whereas the actual intelligence that NATO and the US have is that they are intending or planning to provide weapons to Russia. Professor Guo, what do you make of China waiting until now? What's the timing behind this? Why are they waiting until now to provide weapons if that's what they intend to do?
Okay. First of all, the war is going on for almost a year, and it's becoming attrition war between Ukraine and Russia. And for China, of course, this is a best opportunity to replace Russia's position in the authoritarian regimes, including countries like North Korea, Iran, and Pakistan. So China is basically taking the chance to replace Russia's position, becoming the new leader in the group. And second of all,
So how do they do that by providing weapons? So they become kind of the benefactor, is it, to Russia?
yes, actually, so far China's supply or China's support to Russia is not that concrete yet. But at this very critical timing, as mentioned, both Russia and Ukraine has been trying to mobilize weapons support and also soldiers during the winter. And when the spring comes in mid-March in Europe, and we are expecting to have very high intensity battles happening in Donbass. And because of the shortage of ammunition, so we expect the spring offensive will continue for a month or a month and a half. And then that will be the timing for peace negotiation. So it is not coincident that President Biden visit Kiev and Wang Yi's visit to Moscow. Yeah. So both sides are testing the ground of negotiation from both Ukraine and Russia. So in plain language, both the United States and China are trying to work out a peace talk after the spring offensive. And my speculation is that peace negotiation will fall within the 2014 after Russian invasion to Crimea, and 2022 Russia's invasion to Donbass. So the U.S.-China negotiation will be falling into 2014 to 2022.
Raymond, do you agree with that?
I think much is going to be dependent on what happened in the battleground. I think both sides, I mean Ukraine and Russia, is trying to gain more advantage in terms of territory and in terms of influence on the ground, so as to have a better position in the negotiating table. But I don't expect that the war will be going to end soon. I think there are some areas, especially with regard to territory, both sides cannot back down. Of course, Putin wanted to sustain his rule of Russia, and he needs some to save face. But for Ukraine, it's a matter of territory.
So does China's position is that it wants to support Russia to claim the territory of Ukraine, and because it wants Russia to support its claim over Taiwan?
That's a multi-million question. I think that's the biggest mystery, because in accordance with Western society's language, what is more important is to indicate the principles behind those talks, rather than just simply arguing that you should engage in talking on what basis? Yeah, and if that's on the basis of the status quo gained by illegal waging of war, which is not satisfactory to everyone, and I don't think the international community can tolerate this.
Now, Professor Guo, in today's show we'll be talking about Japan, and analysts have said that the change that will occur in Japan's defense posture through the three strategies, the three defense and national security strategy documents, was actually triggered. There was a catalyst in the Ukraine war, because whilst the threats from China, Russia, North Korea have been growing, it was really the trigger of the Ukraine war that that made it real for Japanese. Can we talk about the challenges in the strategy? They named China as being the biggest challenge to Japan's security. So let's talk about what that means.
First of all, is these gray zone activities of China, and some simple facts. 2021 and 2022, along Chinese Coast Guard vessels have been circulating around East China Sea for more than 331 days. And their aircrafts surrounding East China Sea for forcing the Japanese Air Sail Defense Force to do scramble is more than 770 times per year. It is like 2 to 3 scrambles per day. So these Siamese-sizing or so-called gray zone activities is really killing Japanese military capacity.
And has it been increasing gradually, or did it jump?
It has been increasing for the past 10 years.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And second of all, the major military exercises surrounding the 4 main islands of Japan is like 10 times a year. So it's like almost every month. And 2 or 3 times of them are actually China and Russia joint exercises.
Right.
Surrounding Japan, no matter it's in the air or in the water. And number 3 is cyber attack. Japan is suffering from cyber attack for more than 3 million times per year. Although it's a small number comparing to Taiwan. Taiwan is 30 million times a year. But it is serious enough to sabotage Japanese national security. And number 4 is China's growing military missile capacity, including the newly hypersonic missiles and also gliding missiles. And it is basically largely weakened Japanese ballistic missile defense system, which was Japan has been trying to develop, established for more than 30 years. Yeah, and not to mention China's overall military capacity, especially Air Force and Chinese Navy, has been growing more than 3% per year. It is like a decade, you are looking at 1/3 of growth for overall military capacity. And those extra or additional military capacity of China has been pushing Japan both in the air and in the water. Yeah. So that's the reason why they set the background for Japanese elites to feel this is the biggest challenge, security challenge to Japan since World War II.
Okay. Raymond, so Professor spoke about, I guess, the grey zone tactics, the harassment of Japan in the sea and the air, and also China's own growing strength.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about the territorial disputes, and if you could compare them to Russia and North Korea's threats.
Yes. I think, of course, Japan's often say that they are facing 3 enemies on 3 fronts, and all of 3 are nuclear capabilities. But Japan, I think the Shinzo Abe, the former, the past Prime Minister of Japan, argued that on that ground, Japan should considering at least to be equip themselves with the U.S. nuclear weapons.
But that would never happen under, for sure, under Kishida.
It was still very controversial.
Yeah, but he's actually working toward a nuclear-free world.
Yes.
By May.
I think later on we will talk about the Vladimir Putin's latest statement about the freezing of their STAR program with the United States. Of course, I think the world is always facing the nuclearization of on all sides, both on the sides the countries feeling threatened and those who has already had the nuclear capabilities. I think, of course, with regard to North Korea, this Japan is
let's
facing...
establish China. Let's go back to China.
Right.
So, China, we've got the Senkaku Islands, which both Japan and they claim.
I think, aside from the gray zone tactics employed by China, I think the what was put up before that was also noteworthy, which is creating a controversy, creating a dispute. I think the territorial dispute with regard to Senkaku Islands are long-standing, at least since the end of the 1960s. And, but that should be a question to be put to legal settlement. For example, to resort to a tribunal or a court. But instead, Chinese has always refused to do that. And, but what happened after 2012, the incidents about the so-called nationalization of Senkaku Island, which is not to be judged by its word, but it's just a transfer of the private ownership to the government, to the Tokyo city metropolis. And, but the Chinese utilized that incident to incite nationalistic incitement and to create a dispute and created a status quo by regularly employing naval and aerial incursions into the waters and the airspace of that island, and which is tactics also seen in South China Sea, when firstly Chinese will create a dispute and create a gray zone in legal terms, and also when it is capable, it will employ its Coast Guard or naval forces to cement the advantage they get. So it's a threat, and of course we see in waters surrounding and airspace surrounding Taiwan, like what we are witnessing the regular incursions of the airplane from Chinese Air Force into the air defense zone.
So just to summarize so far, we've been talking about the Senkaku Islands and kind of the tactics that China's been using, and now, of course, the other threat that China poses to Japan actually comes from
the
Taiwan. Alliance,
what you will mention later on about the trilateral one, like between Japan, the Philippines, and United States. We hope that will include Taiwan.
No, sure, but just to summarize for our international audience, the threat from China, you know, Professor talked about the capability increasing, you know, manifestly, and talking about their willingness to harass, and the threat. There is a threat over the Senkaku Islands territorial dispute, but then the other threat comes from the Taiwan contingency itself, because of proximity of Japan. Professor, why does Taiwan matter to Japan? Is it purely the proximity in that they might be caught in the crossfire that happened actually after Nancy Pelosi's visit? You know, can we categorize the different ways in which it's in Japan's interest not to have a Taiwan contingency or to have Taiwan fall to China?
First of all, 92% of Japanese energy supply passing surrounding the waters of Taiwan. That's 92%. And number two, Taiwan is, Taiwan locates in the very hub of all the undersea cable, which linking all the way from Southeast Asia to Japan and all the way to America. And number 3 is Taiwan locates at the highest density of U.S. forces overseas in Okinawa. More than half of the USFJ, the U.S. forces Japan, more than half of USFJ actually deploy in Okinawa. And 2 major bases, one is Kadena, the other is Futema. And
So this means, because there are so many U.S. forces based there, let me bring Raymond in, that, so tell us, step by step, how this might bring them into a contingency.
Apart from what Professor Guo just said, partly is that because geographical vicinity. So whatever happens to Taiwan, especially in the case of armed attack, it will involve Japan. And of course, it will involve the U.S. forces, and especially based in Japanese territories.
So that will make Japan a target for the Chinese missiles.
Possibly. And may I add this? In the 2015 peace and security legislation reformation of Japan, it added a new category, which says if armed attack against a foreign country which is in a close relationship to Japan's security, and it influence Japan's own safety and prosperity of its people, and the Japanese self-defense forces is authorized to use force to repel and to deter those attacks if there's no other means. So which is a foreign country in a close relationship to Japan's security? Of
the
course,
US.
And Taiwan.
Yep.
And before that, Taiwan was considered a surrounding situation in areas surrounding Japan. But that status was elevated to one closer to Japan's existential threats. And apart from itself was attacked, it's the second level, the highest level. When Taiwan is attacked, Japan is going to be involved. So its self-defense force is authorized to take some actions, including by military means, to counter those threats.
Professor Guo, if I could go back to what you said, it ties into what Raymond just mentioned about the energy and about what do Japanese strategists believe is the worst-case scenario that would happen?
First of all, I want to explain that after Chinese PLA reform in 2015, the East theater of PLA, their comeback target is actually not only Taiwan, but the Okinawa and Taiwan. So there's no possible unrealistic for PLA to invade, to attack Taiwan alone without take U.S. forces in Okinawa into consideration. Yeah, so for Japanese strategic planning, they have to plan for the worst case scenario, which is the U.S. forces will, inevitably get involved in Taiwan contingency, which will trigger what Raymond just said, the 2015 new security legislation authorizing Japanese SDF to do military support for U.S. forces. So that's their legal terms.
Vladimir Putin says Russia will boost its nuclear forces. He made these remarks 2 days after announcing Russia would suspend the last remaining arms control agreement with Washington. The new START treaty limited each country's deployed nuclear warheads and allowed for inspections. Putin said Moscow would focus on strengthening its nuclear triad.
Продолжим серийное производство гиперзвуковых комплексов воздушного базирования «Кинжал» и начнем массовые поставки гиперзвуковых ракет морского базирования «Циркон».
Raymond, firstly, how serious is the talk of this nuclear capacity boosting on the eve of, the 1-year anniversary of Ukraine war?
It's not the first time we hear similar words from Vladimir Putin.
That's very true, and yet he kind of tried to walk those comments back, didn't he? When he last raised them, he was berated.
Yes.
And then he tried to. So what do you make of coming out again and talking about it?
I don't know what's the view from Professor Guo, but I will argue it's a hollow threat. It's empty. Why? Because I think Vladimir Putin was very clear about this. It's not just about weapon. Of course, it's forbidden to use the nuclear weapon to gain advantage on war zone. And in legal standard, of course, I think Vladimir Putin made that before. He is very clear about this, and it's only allowed when the survival of a state is threatened, and it's not to use the tactical nuclear weapons to gain advantage on the battleground. And I think on base of that, he knows that this question is a bargaining chip to restrain the Western power and NATO and US forces not to engage into direct conflict with the Russian forces, and maybe restraining their activities in supporting Ukraine. I think that's what aimed for by Vladimir Putin. And thirdly, I think Putin is very clear about that. If he dare to use nuclear weapons, it will concern his own survival. His own downfall will be at stake. Because I think the international community couldn't allow this, because it's a red line. And of course, we see on the NATO side, and on the side of US President Biden, he made it very clear, they will not deploy ground troops or troops by any NATO state to be directly involved in Ukraine war, which is a line has been capped so far. And of course, in exchange of not to engaging into a direct conflict with the nuclear power, major nuclear power, Russia. And if Russia crosses that line, and the whole situation is changed, so it will be a third world war. And if that is not to be tolerated, and the only possible sensible reason is to ask Vladimir Putin to back down and maybe to step down as the president of the Russia Federation. That's the ultimate solution.
Professor Guo, a hollow threat? I mean, the suspension of the New START treaty, is all this kind of propaganda trying to support, essentially the deterrent threat?
In addition to what just Raymond say, I would say it's not a hollow threat. It's a substantial threat, and it's a multiple threat.
So you have a different view to...
In addition to putting a deterrence to NATO countries' support to Ukraine, Putin's decision to retreat from the New START regime is basically making an excuse to provide nuclear support to North Korea.
Right.
Last December, Kim Jong-un clearly said that North Korea will double its nuclear warhead by 10 times. By the year of 2026, North Korea will have nuclear warhead like 100.
So you believe that's with the help of Russia?
From Russia. And Russia's decision to support North Korea to rapidly develop its nuclear capability is also a deterrence to China's reluctant support to Russia. Because with the rapid development of North Korean's nuclear program, it's actually pressure China very, very much, and making North Korea an uncontrollable chip for China to play. Yeah, so I would say Putin is trying to make a smart move and trying to play these multiple deterrents to many different parties.
Yeah, because what's coming through in the media reports about Xi Jinping's trip to Russia to meet with Vladimir Putin is something along the lines of that he wants to reinforce the message that they should not use nuclear weapons. So is this connected with North Korea?
It is, of course. Away from the situation at the battlefield in Ukraine, again, Russia's support, nuclear support to North Korea is a very vital and key issue for China. And it's not only the security situation in East Asia, but it will also involve the relation between China to the States and China's relation to Europe as a whole.
Let's move now on to Japan's defense and the three strategies that they released in December 2022. Raymond, could you summarize what you believe the key changes are?
Okay. In addition to Professor Guo mentioned that the national security strategies of Japan clearly identify China as the greatest strategic challenge to Japan's security. And I think the two most noteworthy changes to the previous stance, one is Japan is going to get the counter-strike capabilities, which is effective means to targeting, to deter the missile attack by allowing Japan to acquire the missile capability to targeting sources of missile attack, no matter in hostile countries, including North Korea and China. The second biggest change is the Japan government is to raise its spending on defense to the level of 2% of GDP annually, and it's already put in action.
And how big would that make them in terms of the defense budget globally?
I have no figures, I think.
Maybe third after the US and China?
It is, yeah. The previous 5 years from 2018 to 2022, Japanese defense budget was 27.5 trillion Japanese yen. And the new program from last December was building up Japanese defense budget to 43 trillion Japanese yen, in addition to annual additional budget of 600 billion Japanese yen. So we are looking at 9 trillion Japanese yen per year, which accounts for around 80 billion US dollars. Will rank Japan number 3 defense budget country in the world.
And what will be the biggest expenditure for that budget?
At current planning, Japan spent almost half of this new budget, mostly in weapon procurement, FMS from the United States, and also indigenous.
What kind of weapon is that?
Including Aegis system,
Okay.
Aegis assault system.
So that's the air defense. Is that the anti-missile?
It's anti-missile system.
Okay.
And also F-35.
Okay. So air defense, that's defensive. F-35, you could say that's offensive?
It's offensive.
Offensive.
Yeah.
Okay.
Of course, it's offensive. Yeah.
Right. So they would gain a lot more defense, but also offensive.
Yeah, and following what Raymond just mentioned, these standoff missiles, the original Japanese Type 12 anti-ship missile only accounts for the range of 100 kilometers. And Japanese government will make it 1,000 kilometers in the coming 2 years.
Which could easily reach Beijing.
It is, yeah. And Japan plans to deploy 1,000 Type 12 extended range missiles in the coming 5 years. And in addition to that, Japanese government is planning to buy 500 units of Tomahawks cruise missiles, which accounts for the shooting range of 500 kilometers. So, pretty simple is the new strategies. Japan is basically adopting what we call A2AD, anti-access and aerial denial capability against Chinese air and naval forces surrounding Japan. Yeah.
So in layman's term, what does that acronym mean? I mean, how does it work?
By deploying so many missiles along the island line of Japan, which will prevent frequent Chinese air and sea activities surrounding Japan. And in addition to what Raymond just said, this counter-strike capability allowing Japanese SDF to launch missile against any enemy possible threat in the enemy's territory.
So once they fire a missile at Japan, they can then counter-strike?
Yes, they can counter-strike, yes.
Okay, and then that will provide the deterrence, hopefully,
Yes.
for them not to fire in the first place. Raymond, just to end this section, tell me about the change in the relationship between US and Japan.
Okay, I think the both sides are in intention to cement their U.S.-Japan alliance, which is a cornerstone of a West Pacific security. Apart from that, I think they made it very clear that both sides, the posture or the deployment, the stance of the deployment of troops is going to change. I think that's a response to the geography of this area, because there are so many islands. So the U.S. said very clearly they were going to deploy small-scale but mobile, highly mobile, versatile forces, including marine forces on those islands, which means that it's a more diversified deployment of troops, and make it more difficult for the enemies to target them, to erase them. And may I mention that in the CSIS war game, one situation is that they calculate that once the armed attack is going on, started, that the Japanese air forces and naval ships will be attacked and be eliminated to a great proportion. To avoid that, so now the stance, the posture by the two armies, two forces, are to diversify their deployment of troops.
And along those lines, I think there is the mention of the Japanese now taking primary responsibility for defense. So, Professor, does this change that relationship between the US and Japan, in that now Japan becomes a more equal partner?
It is. Japan is shouldering more and more security responsibility with the United States, and President Biden is planning to visit Hiroshima for the G7 summit, and we are expecting to see the two leaders, U.S. and Japan, will announce the new guidelines for U.S.-Japan defense cooperation, which is the fourth version of this guideline.
Right. Okay. Let's look out for that then. Not only has Japan faced up to the fact that it will likely be drawn into a Taiwan contingency, the Philippines has also said it cannot avoid being impacted, as it lies to the south of Taiwan, just 193 kilometers from its northern island of Luzon. At the start of February, a defense arrangement was signed between Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida. The deal would give Japanese troops more access to territory in the Philippines, and comes not long after the US said its military would secure access to 4 more bases in the country. The Japan-Philippines agreement will allow reciprocal port calls and aircraft visits, and the vital transfer of more defense equipment and technology. Japan, Taiwan and the Philippines lie along what's known as the first island chain. Together with the second island chain, they make up the main Cold War era American defense lines to contain the influence of both China and Russia. Raymond, if I can come to you. So the Philippines, as we said, like Japan and Taiwan, part of the first island chain. Do you believe that there's a modern version of perhaps just one line which includes Australia?
Oh, I think so. I think so. Australia, of course, is also very active on in the crucial part of the alliance, including what we see on AUKUS. And may I add that the Philippines stance and also feel the threat by China, including what happened in South China Sea and the Coast Guard aggressiveness against Philippine Coast Guard. And I think Marcos Jr. is very clear that on one hand he wants to make maintain a friendship, friendly relations with China, but on the other hand, he will not refrain from establishing closer security ties with the United States and Japan, as we see in the clip.
Professor Guo, so is there now a cord, a new defense line, shall we say it, which is now unbroken in terms of US allies forming a line to contain China?
Of course, when as mentioned from last section, there is coming to a stalemate of military deployment, between China, North Korea, and Russia, and versus U.S., Japan, and South Korea. This kind of situation, STOMAT is making the Philippines becoming very important. And so that's the reason why you see State Secretary Blinken visited Philippines last year. Vice President Harris also visited Philippines last year, and also the Defense Secretary Austin visited the Philippines in February this year, and want to increase the U.S. bases from 5 to 9. And right now the 10th base is under negotiation.
Right.
And that's on the one hand. On the other hand is Japan and the Philippines basically already signed 2 military agreements. One is what we call AXA, providing logistics support to each other. The other is called GSOMIA. It's an intelligence exchange agreement. And not to mention, starting from year 2016, Japanese government decided to donate Coast Guard vessels to the Philippines, and also patrol airplane TC-90 to the Philippines, and also reconnaissance radar to the Philippines. And now Japan is planning to provide major battle tank, the Type 74, to the Philippines in the coming 2 or 3 years. And also these Japanese vessels, retired vessels to the Philippines. And put it simple, Japan is basically playing the role to fill the gap between the U.S. and the Philippines. I mean, the Philippines is important to the States because of location, providing military bases for U.S. forces. But not much military providing from the States to the Philippines.
In terms of weaponry.
In terms of weaponry. And Japan could shoulder that kind of responsibility, provide very initial stage or outdated weapons, but which is still very effective to the Philippines. So which will naturally make the 3 countries to link together in terms of defending the first island chain. So that's the reason why last week President Marcos Jr. Also said it is quite a natural tendency for the 3 countries to consider trilateral security agreement.
And now there are joint exercises, the Balo-Katan, between the US and the Philippines coming up. Are there also other joint exercises between these 3 partners?
Right now, there is an Iron Fist joint exercise between US and Japan going on for 2 weeks. And usually Iron Fist joint exercise happen on the ground of the US. And this is the first time it's at southern Kyushu all the way to Okinawa. And Japan might be joining this joint exercise in April between the Philippines and the States at the Philippine Islands for the first time. So we are basically seeing from military agreement to weaponry provide and to joint exercises together. Yeah. So my observation in the coming 2 or 3 years, Japan and the Philippines will sign this visiting force agreement. In addition to that, they will also, it's actually under negotiation, is the RAA, allowing each other's forces to enter their territorial air, water.
And Raymond, before we move to Taiwan, let's talk about enmeshing Australia into this relationship. We know about the rotation of the B-52 bombers.
Yes.
That was recently agreed. What else is there?
Of course, what triggered the signing of AUKUS, the trilateral security cooperation between United Kingdom, United States, and Australia, is that to enable Australia to have the nuclear submarine technologies. and to shoulder part of the responsibility for the U.S. Navy in South China Sea.
Nuclear-powered submarines.
Nuclear-powered submarines, to shoulder part of the responsibility to defend the South China Sea. And of course, on that ground, Australia is very active. And just before today, the latest report from the Australian Intelligence Agency says the Chinese influence operations are mainly targeting Australia, and which made it a #1 target overseas. And of course, he said the Australian public are not much influenced. And of course, Australia is also feeling the threat from China, including what happened in South China Sea is a clear violation of international law, what happened in Taiwan Strait, and also in what happened in the Pacific Island states, when China is very active and positively engaging in building the alliances there, and also building radar station and then possibly naval bases there.
So we could probably summarize that for Japan and for Philippines, they will be directly impacted by a Taiwan contingency. However, a partner like Australia, it's the indirect threat and the aggressions that it faces from Beijing. Can we move finally to Taiwan? Professor Guo, Liberal Democratic Party Policy Research Council Chairman Hagioda Koichi was in Taipei in December in 2022, and he spoke to Taiwan about deepening Japan and Taiwan's security cooperation. What does that mean?
First of all, this security cooperation is, meaning about the economic security. Hagioda-san was here, first of all, to talk about semiconductor cooperation between, further cooperation between Japan and Taiwan. And number two is about Japanese national evacuation during Taiwanese contingency. As far as I know, Japanese government is under tremendous pressure from Japanese civilian and the private companies, worrying about the possible or necessary evacuation from Taiwan during Taiwan contingency. So, which was also quoted in the new 3 strategies.
Hello, I'm Yin Khvat of Taiwan Talks. We just discussed why Japan is facing the most severe and complex security situation since World War II. What we want to know from you is whether Japan's change in defense strategy is radical or simply a reaction to its environment. Let us know below in the YouTube comments. Also, if you like our shows, please hit subscribe. Thank you for watching today. Stay safe and see you next time.